Clarence House reportedly turned icy the moment Prince William refused to sign off on Queen Camilla's latest demand. Courtiers described a silence so sharp it unsettled even veteran palace aides. What began as a routine succession discussion quickly spiraled into one of the most explosive confrontations the monarchy has allegedly faced since the sun-drenched coronation of 2023. And according to insiders, William's objection was not merely personal, it was a direct challenge to Camilla's growing influence over the crown itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the closed-door meeting had initially been organized as part of a wider review concerning future royal residences, internal staffing structures, and long-term financial protocols tied to the monarchy's transition into what some insiders have quietly labeled the post-Charles era. But somewhere between discussions surrounding ceremonial duties and private estate management, the tone allegedly shifted. Fast. According to various interpretations circulating through palace administrative streams, I see a proposal that Prince William immediately viewed as crossing an invisible but sacred line inside the House of Windsor. The details remain fiercely guarded, though palace insiders whisper the issue centered around expanded privileges connected to Camilla's inner family circle, including discussions involving future access, influence, and institutional standing, once William eventually ascends the throne. And while no official confirmation exists, several royal correspondents have hinted that the request allegedly touched sensitive areas tied to residences and privileges historically reserved for direct working royals alone. Within the sacred geography of the British monarchy, that distinction matters more than almost anything else. Sources close to senior palace staff claim William's reaction stunned the room not because he shouted, but because he reportedly did not. There was no theatrical confrontation, no emotional outburst. Instead, aides describe something far colder, a deliberate refusal delivered with what one insider called devastating clarity. The future king allegedly viewed the proposal as a dangerous breach of royal tradition, one capable of blurring, the fragile boundary between public duty and private entitlement, and for a monarchy already struggling under intense scrutiny since King Charles's health crisis became public in early 2024, the stakes could not have been higher. What reportedly unsettled palace aides most was the fact that King Charles himself appeared unable to regain control of the discussion. Various interpretations of the meeting describe the monarch as visibly exhausted, physically diminished, and emotionally trapped between loyalty to his wife and loyalty to the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to protect. Insiders whisper that several attempts were made to soften the disagreement, yet William allegedly remained unmoved. To him, this was not merely a family debate. It was about the future shape of the crown itself. And perhaps that is why so many within palace circles now believe this confrontation had been building quietly for years. Long before this tense meeting inside Clarence House, reports suggest tensions had already existed beneath the polished surface of royal unity. Different factions inside the firm allegedly held deeply different visions for the monarchy's future. One side favored modernization tightly controlled through discipline and restraint. The other, according to critics within the old guard, risked allowing personal loyalties and private networks to drift dangerously close to institutional power. By the time the meeting finally ended, insiders claim nothing had been resolved. No agreement, no compromise. Just an icy silence lingering behind palace walls as senior aides quietly exited the room, fully aware they may have just witnessed the beginning of a devastating internal struggle over legacy, influence, and the future of the House of Windsor itself. But what exactly did Camilla ask for that caused the future king to draw such a hard line inside palace walls? For years, Queen Camilla was said to operate through quiet influence rather than public authority. Yet palace administrative streams now suggest her ambitions may have extended far beyond ceremonial duties. According to various interpretations circulating among royal insiders, a new effort to secure lasting institutional power for the Parker Bowles faction may have finally triggered William's resistance. What allegedly began as subtle behind-the-scenes requests slowly evolved into something more serious within the highest corridors of royal administration. Sources familiar with internal palace discussions claim Camilla had spent years carefully strengthening her position inside the monarchy, not through public declarations, but through relationships, private counsel, and strategic proximity to the king himself. Unlike previous royal consorts who understood the invisible boundaries surrounding influence and inheritance, critics inside the old guard reportedly feared that Camilla's circle had started testing limits that Queen Elizabeth II once enforced with near uncompromising rigidity. And within an institution built on centuries of hierarchy, even the smallest shift in privilege can ignite panic behind palace walls. Reports suggest the growing concerns centered around expanded access and protections tied to members of Camilla's immediate family network. While no official proposals have been made public, insiders whisper that discussions involving future residences, ceremonial standing, and financial accommodations allegedly reached levels that deeply unsettled senior royal aides. Some palace commentators even claim the issue touched sensitive conversations involving merged long-term estate usage connected to Balmoral and broader funding structures tied to the Duchy of Lancaster areas considered politically untouchable within the sacred framework of the monarchy. That alone reportedly sent alarm bells echoing through royal administrative circles. To outside observers, the issue may appear minor, but inside the firm, legacy is everything. Properties like Balmoral are not merely residences. They are symbols of continuity, sacrifice, and national identity stretching back generations. The duchy structures themselves represent carefully protected mechanisms designed to preserve the monarchy's independence from political chaos and private opportunism. And according to those familiar with Prince William's increasingly disciplined approach to royal duty, any attempt to blur those boundaries was always destined to provoke resistance. That resistance, insiders claim, became impossible to contain during the now infamous palace meeting. William reportedly viewed the monarchy not as a family business to be expanded through personal loyalties, but as what one palace source described as a sacred trust held on behalf of the nation. It was a philosophy heavily shaped by Queen Elizabeth II herself, whose reign was built on strict institutional separation between public service and private benefit. Several longtime staff members allegedly began drawing quiet comparisons between the late Queen's uncompromising rules and the more flexible atmosphere that emerged following Charles and Camilla's rise to the throne. And those comparisons reportedly cut deep, because while Charles was often viewed as emotionally driven and conflict-averse, Elizabeth II governed through structure, distance, and discipline. She understood that public confidence in the crown depended not on popularity, but on restraint. Palace insiders now whisper that William inherited far more of that philosophy than many initially realized. Behind his calm public image, aides allegedly describe a future monarch increasingly determined to tighten royal operations and restore stricter institutional boundaries before public trust erodes any further. That growing determination reportedly sent waves of anxiety through palace staff already struggling with mounting internal tensions. Different factions within the monarchy allegedly began interpreting the confrontation in radically different ways. Some believed Camilla was simply attempting to protect those closest to her as Charles's health concerns intensified. Others feared something far more destabilizing: the slow emergence of competing power centers inside the House of Windsor itself. And as whispers spread through private offices, royal residences, and administrative corridors, one unsettling realization allegedly began taking hold among senior aides. This was no longer just a disagreement about privileges. It was becoming a battle over the future identity of the monarchy. However, the true shock came when William reportedly invoked a royal principle rarely spoken aloud in modern palace politics. Sources close to Kensington Palace claim Prince William's objection was delivered with chilling precision. No raised voice, no dramatic exit. Just a calm but devastating refusal that reportedly froze the room. In that moment, insiders whisper the heir to the throne made one thing unmistakably clear: the crown would not become negotiable. According to various interpretations of the confrontation now circulating through palace circles, the atmosphere changed instantly after William allegedly rejected the proposal unabashed, utterly during private discussions with senior royal aides present. Those familiar with the exchange claim the refusal came so directly, so unmistakably, that even longtime courtiers reportedly struggled to hide their shock. Because within modern royal politics, disagreements are usually softened behind layers of diplomacy, silence, and carefully managed ambiguity. But this time, insiders whisper there was none of that. William allegedly delivered his position with cold certainty, leaving little room for reinterpretation. What made the moment especially explosive was not only the refusal itself, but the principle behind it. Sources close to Kensington Palace claim William repeatedly emphasized what he allegedly described as the need to preserve institutional integrity inside the monarchy at all costs. That phrase, according to royal commentators, carried enormous weight behind palace walls. It was not merely criticism, it was a warning. A declaration that the future king believed certain boundaries could not be crossed without damaging the crown itself. And for some within Camilla's circle, the message reportedly landed like a direct political strike. Palace insiders now whisper. When Princess Anne emerged, that several senior courtiers immediately interpreted William's stance as an unmistakable signal to those attempting to expand influence around the king. The monarchy, in William's reported view, could not survive if private loyalties began reshaping institutional decisions traditionally governed by precedent, restraint, and duty. Sources suggest he feared that allowing even small exceptions would gradually weaken the fragile public trust the royal family had spent generations protecting. In many ways, aides claim, William's position reflected something far deeper than frustration. It reflected fear. Fear that the monarchy itself could drift into dangerous territory during one of the most unstable periods of modern royal history. And according to insiders, William was not standing alone. Though Princess Catherine reportedly remained far from the center of the public confrontation, palace whispers suggest she quietly supported her husband's position throughout the escalating internal dispute. Sources familiar with Kensington Palace dynamics claim Catherine viewed the monarchy through the same disciplined lens as William I, shaped by service, sacrifice, and stability rather than but personal advantage. Some insiders even suggest her influence helped reinforce William's resolve during moments when pressure inside the palace intensified. Together, they allegedly presented a united front that deeply unsettled certain royal factions expecting compromise. It was around this stage that comparisons to Princess Anne reportedly began spreading more openly among palace staff. Anne, long regarded as the monarchy's iron-willed enforcer, built her reputation on brutal discipline and unwavering loyalty to institutional order. Now, according to royal commentators, many insiders suddenly recognized similar traits emerging in William himself: the calm demeanor, the refusal to bend under emotional pressure, the willingness to prioritize the firm before family. For years, critics underestimated William, viewing him as cautious, even passive at times. But inside palace corridors, that perception allegedly changed dramatically after this meeting. Several royal correspondents have since described the confrontation as the heir stepping into command, not publicly, not symbolically, but internally, where real power inside the monarchy is often exercised through silence, access, and control rather than spectacle. Sources suggest even some veteran palace aides left the meeting with the uneasy realization that a transition had quietly begun long before any formal succession could ever take place. Because while King Charles still wears the crown, insiders now believe William has started defining the rules of the monarchy that will eventually follow. Yet behind the scenes, King Charles was reportedly facing an impossible dilemma between loyalty to his wife and duty to the monarchy. Observers say the most tragic figure in the unfolding confrontation may actually be King Charles himself. Already weakened by ongoing health concerns since early 2024, the monarch reportedly found himself trapped between two competing forces: the wife who stood beside him for decades, and the son preparing to inherit the crown. According to palace insiders, the strain surrounding the confrontation reached levels far more emotionally devastating than the public could ever fully understand. For years, Charles had reportedly worked tirelessly to maintain a fragile sense of balance inside the monarchy. After decades spent waiting to ascend the throne, he finally achieved the position that had, and then defined his entire life. Yet instead of stability, his reign allegedly became consumed by crisis after crisis: family fractures, public distrust, health battles, and now a deepening internal power struggle unfolding behind palace walls. Those close to the king whisper that the latest clash between Camilla and William struck him on a profoundly personal level because it forced him into a role he has always struggled with most: choosing between emotional loyalty and institutional duty. Reports suggest Charles initially attempted to calm tensions without taking a firm side. Sources familiar with the situation claim he hoped the disagreement could quietly dissolve through private compromise, subtle adjustments, and carefully managed diplomacy. That approach, insiders say, reflected Charles's lifelong instinct toward mediation rather than confrontation. Unlike Princess Anne's iron discipline or William's increasingly direct style, Charles reportedly believed emotional reconciliation was still possible. But the reality inside the palace was already shifting too quickly for silence to contain. Palace administrative streams now suggest aides became increasingly concerned that the ongoing stress surrounding the dispute was worsening instability within the royal household itself. Senior staff allegedly noticed growing divisions among advisors, private secretaries, and longtime courtiers who had once operated with rigid unity. Meetings reportedly became tense. Communication between different royal offices allegedly grew colder and more formal. And beneath the polished public appearances, insiders whisper there was growing fear that the monarchy was quietly entering one of its most dangerous internal periods since the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage decades earlier. At the center of it all stood William, increasingly convinced that delaying action would only deepen the crisis. According to sources close to Kensington Palace, the Prince of Wales allegedly viewed hesitation as the greatest threat of all. Every compromise, every delayed decision, every blurred boundary risked creating long-term damage to an institution already fighting to preserve public confidence. Insiders claim William believed the monarchy could no longer afford ambiguity about where power, privilege, and authority truly belonged. And while some interpreted his position as cold or overly right, quietly viewed it as necessary survival. Meanwhile, Camilla's supporters reportedly felt blindsided by the speed and severity of the resistance forming against her. Several insiders claim members of her inner circle believed she was being unfairly isolated after years spent helping stabilize Charles during some of the darkest periods of his public life. To them, William's refusal allegedly felt less like institutional caution and more like deliberate exclusion. That growing resentment reportedly intensified after whispers spread suggesting certain palace figures had already begun limiting access and influence around key royal discussions. It was during this stage of the conflict that the so-called old guard within palace administration allegedly began quietly choosing sides. Some remained fiercely loyal to Charles and Camilla, believing stability required protecting the king's immediate household at all costs. Others reportedly aligned themselves more closely with William's vision of a disciplined, tightly controlled monarchy modeled after Queen Elizabeth II's reign. And as those silent alliances formed behind private office doors, royal historians and commentators began drawing increasingly uncomfortable comparisons to past succession tensions that once threatened the stability of the crown itself. Because beneath the formal titles and polished traditions, the monarchy has always been vulnerable to one thing above all else: uncertainty about the future. And insiders now whisper that uncertainty was spreading rapidly through the palace, creating an atmosphere of quiet distrust unlike anything seen since the final years of the late Queen's reign. But while tensions grew inside the palace, another powerful royal figure was said to be watching everything unfold from the shadows. If palace whispers are to be believed, Princess Anne did not need to raise her voice to alter the course of the conflict. The hardest-working royal allegedly entered the situation with what insiders now describe as a brutal form of bureaucratic warfare, one that quietly reinforced William's position while isolating Camilla's expanding influence. For decades, Anne has occupied a strange and almost intimidating position within the House of Windsor. She rarely seeks public attention. She avoids emotional interviews, public drama, and theatrical displays of info. Yet behind palace walls, royal insiders have long viewed her as one of the most formidable forces inside the monarchy, not because of charisma, but because of discipline. According to those familiar with the internal mechanics of royal administration, Anne understands the institution better than almost anyone alive. She understands where authority truly exists, how palace systems function, and most importantly, how control can be exercised without ever appearing confrontational. That reputation reportedly became critical the moment tensions between William and Camilla escalated beyond private disagreement. Sources close to palace administrative circles now suggest Anne quietly backed William almost immediately after the explosive Clarence House meeting. But unlike William's direct refusal, Anne's approach was allegedly far more surgical. Insiders whisper that no dramatic declarations were made. No public alignment was announced. Instead, palace structures themselves reportedly began shifting in subtle but unmistakable ways. Meetings became harder to arrange. Certain approvals slowed down. Internal reviews allegedly appeared where none had existed before, and according to royal commentators, that was no coincidence. It was around this time that insiders first began whispering about something informally labeled the Iron Protocol. Though never officially acknowledged, palace staff reportedly used the phrase to describe a tightening of internal procedures surrounding access, approvals, and administrative oversight tied to sensitive royal operations. According to various interpretations, Anne allegedly played a major role in reinforcing those mechanisms behind the scenes. The message, insiders claim, was simple but devastating. The monarchy's institutional core would be protected at all costs, even if it meant quietly freezing out expanding influence networks inside the palace itself. Reports suggest senior staff reshuffles soon followed the tense confrontation, further fueling speculation that a silent counteroffensive had already begun. Several longtime aides reportedly found their responsibilities altered or reduced, while newer figures viewed as closely aligned with William's vision allegedly gained greater visibility inside strategic discussions. Palace administrative streams also hint at reviews involving security clearances, access permissions, scions, and scheduling authority connected to sensitive royal properties and operational planning. Officially, none of these changes were linked to internal tensions, but according to insiders, the timing was impossible to ignore. For Anne, sources suggest the issue was never personal. It was institutional. Palace commentators have repeatedly described her as one of the fiercest protectors of Queen Elizabeth II's legacy, particularly the late monarch's belief that the crown survives only when discipline outweighs personal ambition. Anne reportedly inherited that philosophy completely. Unlike more modern royal figures who embraced emotional openness and public relatability, Anne remained deeply committed to the older model of monarchy, one built on hierarchy, restraint, sacrifice, and absolute clarity regarding duty. To many within the old guard, she represented continuity with the reign of Elizabeth II more than any other living royal. That is precisely why her alleged involvement sent such shockwaves through palace circles. William's resistance alone was significant, but Anne's quiet support transformed the conflict into something far more dangerous for Camilla's allies. Because NNE was not viewed as emotional or impulsive. She was viewed as strategic, calculated, ruthlessly loyal to the institution itself. And once palace insiders began sensing her influence behind the scenes, many reportedly concluded that the balance of power inside the monarchy was beginning to shift permanently. Royal commentators increasingly started referring to Anne as the guardian of the flame, the royal figure entrusted with preserving the monarchy's institutional soul during one of its most unstable modern chapters. And according to those watching events unfold behind closed doors, her silent intervention may have done more than merely support William. It may have fundamentally changed the outcome of the struggle before the public even realized a battle was taking place. And according to royal insiders, that silent counteroffensive may have triggered panic within Camilla's inner circle. Within days, reports of tension inside royal residences allegedly became impossible to suppress. Staff movements changed. Meetings were abruptly canceled. Even seasoned royal correspondents began hinting that a devastating internal fracture was unfolding behind the monarchy's carefully controlled, Miao-led public image. At first, palace officials reportedly attempted to contain the growing unease through silence and routine public appearances. But according to insiders familiar with operations inside both Clarence House and Kensington Palace, the atmosphere behind closed doors had already become deeply strained. What once functioned as a carefully synchronized institution allegedly began splintering into isolated camps, operating with growing suspicion toward one another. Staff members who previously coordinated seamlessly between royal households reportedly found communication becoming colder, slower, and unusually formal. Emails were allegedly rewritten multiple times before being sent. Meetings once handled informally suddenly required layers of approval. And beneath the polished language of palace administration, insiders whisper that trust itself was beginning to collapse. Sources close to royal staff claim Camilla's allies felt increasingly marginalized as William's influence quietly expanded following the confrontation. According to various interpretations circulating through palace circles, individuals believed to be aligned with Camilla allegedly found themselves excluded. Sensitive planning conversations tied to future operations, ceremonial restructuring, and long-term royal logistics. Some insiders even described the shift as a form of institutional isolation not dramatic enough to provoke public scandal, but calculated enough to limit influence where it mattered most. Inside the monarchy, power is rarely seized loudly. It is redirected through access, proximity, and control over information. And according to palace administrative streams, those mechanisms were already changing rapidly. At the same time, reports suggest William's team began accelerating preparations tied to the monarchy's future transition strategy. While no formal succession process was publicly announced, insiders claim palace planners quietly intensified discussions surrounding long-term operational continuity in the event of further deterioration in King Charles's health. That alone reportedly sent waves of anxiety through royal households already struggling under enormous internal pressure. Because for many within the palace, the implications were unmistakable. William was no longer preparing for a distant future. He was preparing for a future that suddenly felt dangerous, mousely close. Royal journalists including Ingrid Seward and Robert Hardman began subtly referencing unusual shifts in tone surrounding palace operations, further fueling speculation that deeper tensions were unfolding behind the scenes. Though neither directly confirmed internal conflict, their commentary reportedly reflected growing awareness among royal observers that something significant had changed inside the institution. Longtime correspondents noted increasingly rigid public messaging, unexpected scheduling adjustments, and unusual levels of caution surrounding appearances involving senior royals. To seasoned royal watchers, these were not random anomalies. They were warning signs. Meanwhile, palace morale allegedly continued deteriorating as uncertainty spread throughout royal administrative offices. Staff members reportedly feared becoming caught between competing factions during one of the monarchy's most fragile periods in decades. Some insiders described an environment of constant tension, where every procedural change or canceled meeting triggered fresh rumors about power struggles unfolding behind closed doors. Others quietly compared the atmosphere to earlier moments. A sea of royal instability that once threatened the public image of the crown itself. Those comparisons reportedly became increasingly difficult to ignore. Historians and veteran palace commentators began drawing parallels to previous succession-era conflicts that exposed divisions within the royal family during moments of national uncertainty. From the abdication crisis of Edward VIII to the emotional collapse surrounding Charles and Diana, the monarchy has repeatedly faced periods where private fractures risked becoming public disasters. And according to insiders, many within the palace feared this latest confrontation carried similarly dangerous potential not because of scandal alone, but because it struck directly at the question of who would ultimately define the monarchy's future identity. That question now loomed over every corridor, every briefing, and every carefully managed public appearance. Because beneath the surface of canceled meetings and silent rivalries, something far more consequential was unfolding, a battle not simply over influence, but over the soul of the institution itself. But the conflict was never only about influence, it was about the future shape of the monarchy itself. According to those familiar with the Duchy of Cornwall's rigorous standards, Prince William has spent years preparing for a monarchy built on discipline, restraint, and public trust. And insiders now claim the clash with Camilla represented far more than a family disagreement. It was a defining battle over what the crown would become in the post-Charles era. For much of his life, William was often portrayed as cautious, even reluctant in comparison to stronger personalities within the royal family. But according to palace insiders, that perception concealed something far more deliberate. While public attention focused on scandals, family feuds, and succession speculation, William was reportedly studying the institution itself, how it survives, how it collapses, and how public trust can disappear faster than any royal title can protect it. Sources close to the Duchy of Cornwall suggest the future king gradually developed a philosophy rooted not in glamour or emotional popularity, but in control. Tight control. Because in William's reported view, the monarchy's survival in the modern era depends on convincing the public that the crown still understands sacrifice, and limits. That belief allegedly explains why the confrontation with Camilla became so explosive behind closed doors. According to various interpretations circulating among senior royal aides, William feared that any visible expansion of privilege tied to extended family networks could trigger public backlash at a moment when confidence in institutions across Britain already feels dangerously fragile. Palace insiders claim he viewed the monarchy as existing under permanent scrutiny, every residence, every title, every financial arrangement carrying symbolic weight far beyond private family dynamics. To William, reports suggest, Even the appearance of institutional favoritism represented a risk the crown could no longer afford. That philosophy reportedly shaped his vision for a smaller, more tightly controlled monarchy long before tensions with Camilla ever surfaced publicly. Sources close to Kensington Palace claim William has spent years quietly preparing for a streamlined royal structure centered around a narrow group of senior working royals bound by visible duty and accountability. In that model, access to influence is not inherited through personal closeness to the monarch, but earned through service to the institution itself. And according to insiders, that distinction became one of the defining fault lines inside the palace confrontation. At the center of William's long-term vision stands Catherine, whose role within the monarchy has allegedly become increasingly important behind the scenes. Royal commentators frequently describe the Princess of Wales as embodying the exact qualities William believes the institution must project moving forward: stability, restraint, humility, and emotional discipline under relentless public pressure. Unlike previous eras shaped by chaos and scandal, aides suggest William sees Catherine as proof that the monarchy can still inspire trust through consistency rather than spectacle. Together, insiders claim they represent a deliberate return to the quieter model of royal service associated with Queen Elizabeth II's reign. That comparison to the late Queen reportedly matters enormously to William. According to palace sources, Elizabeth II's approach to monarchy remains the blueprint guiding many of his decisions. She understood that the crown survives not because it adapts to every emotional current, but because it remains visibly larger than the individuals temporarily serving it. Duty before comfort, institution before personality, silence before self-interest. Those principles allegedly shaped William far more deeply than many royal observers initially realized. And during the confrontation with Camilla, insiders claim one phrase quietly resurfaced inside palace discussions with striking force: the firm before the family. For some royal aides, that phrase carried chilling implications, because it suggested William was prepared to make difficult, even painful decisions if he believed the institution required it. Sources familiar with palace operations claim the confrontation ultimately became viewed internally as far more than a disagreement about influence or access. It became a generational turning point, a moment when the future king allegedly signaled the monarchy under his reign would operate according to stricter boundaries than many had expected. And as those boundaries quietly began taking shape behind palace walls, even longtime courtiers reportedly sensed that the balance of power inside the House of Windsor was already shifting. Not dramatically, not publicly, but steadily, and act deliberately, and perhaps permanently. Now, as palace tensions continue behind closed doors, many believe the monarchy may already be entering a new era of power. In the end, insiders whisper the confrontation may be remembered not for the argument itself, but for what it revealed about the monarchy's future. Behind the velvet curtains, amid exhausted courtiers and silent corridors, a new balance of power reportedly emerged, one shaped less by sentiment and more by survival. For weeks, palace officials allegedly fought to contain the growing speculation surrounding the confrontation between Prince William and Queen Camilla. Publicly, the monarchy continued projecting calm continuity through carefully managed appearances, polished speeches, and the familiar rituals that have long protected the crown from instability. But behind closed doors, according to royal insiders, something fundamental had shifted. The old assumptions about influence, authority, and succession no longer appeared secure. And as private tensions hardened into institutional divisions, many inside the palace reportedly began realizing they were witnessing the quiet formation of a completely different royal era. The center of that transformation stood Prince William, increasingly viewed by both allies and critics as the stabilizing force guiding the monarchy through one of its most fragile modern chapters. According to those familiar with palace operations, William's response to the crisis fundamentally changed how senior courtiers perceived him. No longer merely the future king waiting patiently in the background, he allegedly emerged as a figure willing to enforce boundaries even when doing so risked painful internal conflict. That shift carried enormous consequences, because within the House of Windsor, real authority has never depended solely on titles. It depends on whether the institution itself believes someone can protect it during moments of vulnerability. And insiders now whisper that many inside the palace believe William already passed that test. Meanwhile, reports suggest Queen Camilla's influence began facing growing resistance from multiple layers of palace administration following the confrontation, not through dramatic public humiliation, but through something colder and more difficult to fight: institutional isolation. According to various interpretations circulating T.I.L. circles, the structures once quietly supporting Camilla's expanding role allegedly became far more guarded after William and Anne's intervention. Access reportedly narrowed. Informal influence weakened. Strategic conversations increasingly shifted toward figures more closely aligned with the future monarchy William hopes to build. To some insiders, the message became painfully clear. The center of gravity inside the royal family was moving, and in the middle of that transition remained King Charles, reportedly exhausted by the emotional and political weight surrounding the conflict. Sources close to palace aides claim the monarch spent much of the aftermath attempting to preserve some form of fragile peace between competing factions within his own family. Yet the reality confronting Charles was deeply painful. The institution he had waited a lifetime to lead was now evolving beyond his control, shaped increasingly by the priorities of the next generation rather than the compromises of the present one. Insiders whisper that this realization left the king emotionally torn between protecting his wife and accepting the hardening institutional direction William and Anne Bell, Eve necessary for survival. It was during this uncertain period that palace commentators reportedly began describing the growing alliance between Princess Anne and Prince William as a modern heirs accord. Though unofficial, the phrase captured the belief spreading quietly among senior royal observers that Anne had effectively become William's most important institutional ally. Together, insiders claim they represented a return to the older philosophy of monarchy championed by Queen Elizabeth II, one rooted in sacrifice, restraint, and the belief that the crown must always stand above personal ambition. That principle now appears to sit at the heart of the monarchy's internal transformation. Because beneath the emotional tensions, the family loyalties, and the whispered palace rivalries lies a much larger question about what the British monarchy is ultimately meant to be. A private dynasty protecting personal networks, or a sacred national institution bound by duty, discipline, and public trust? According to royal insiders, William's confrontation with Camilla forced that question into the open more directly than any internal conflict in years, and in doing so, it may have permanently redefined the monarchy's future path. Perhaps that is the real legacy of the confrontation. Not victory, not defeat, but clarity. A painful reminder that within the House of Windsor, survival has always demanded sacrifice. Personal comfort fades. Emotional loyalties fracture. But the institution endures because certain figures are ultimately willing to place duty above themselves, no matter how devastating the cost may become behind palace walls. Because within the sacred geography of the British monarchy, power may shift quietly, but legacy remembers everything. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.